might see things look a little different here than our usual videos with exciting news. The Brad D. Center for Business and Innovation recently opened, and so the iCenter is getting moved over that way. They're still setting it up, but we might be back in there. And also exciting news, we are currently sitting in the future home of Drinko's podcast recording studio. So it's not fully set up. You're probably going to see a lot of changes over our next couple of videos. So just keep an eye out on that. We'll keep you updated on when this space will be available to record your own podcasting. Dr. Lumpkin, would you like to take us into today's video?
So, yes, welcome everybody. This is our latest episode of HerdCon Presents Book Chats. And I want to remind everybody that the views expressed in this podcast are the opinions of the participants, ourselves, and no one else, and do not represent or reflect Marshall University. Something to that equivalent?
Yes.
Okay.
Or HerdCon.
Yeah, or HerdCon. So anyway, this is our first episode of 2024. We are so far into the future now, it seems. And this week we'll be talking about Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, the Oprah's book choice. It was an Oprah's book choice and a Pulitzer Prize winner. And I am here with Meghan Sexton-Harness of the library, and I am Cody Lumpkin of the Department of English. And we're happy to talk about this book. And we'll kick things off with Meghan doing a little intro for Barbara Kingsolver.
Yes. So Barbara Kingsolver was originally born in Annapolis, Maryland, but spent most of her life growing up in eastern Kentucky, where her father was a physician for poor and rural areas. Though Kingsolver's first books, The Bean Trees, Animal Dreams, and Pigs in Heaven, focus on American stories, one of Kingsolver's most known works, The Poisonwood Bible, takes place in the Belgian Congo during the Democratic Republic of Congo's fight for independence. After The Poison Bible, Kingsolver would turn her focus to the United States, writing several books on Appalachia and The Lacuna, a historical fiction book about a Mexican-American author during the McCarthy anti-communist era. This book would go on to win the Orange Prize for Fiction, now known as the Women's Prize for Fiction. Her next big win would come with the publication of Demon Copperhead, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize and the Women's Prize for Fiction once again.
Yeah, so I think maybe just to kind of start off here, a little bit of context about the book and its inspirations. Demon Copperhead, if you're not familiar, it is a modern retelling set in Appalachia of the Charles Dickens novel David Copperfield. If you can see on it's well over 1,000 pages. Yeah, it gets into 1,000 pages. It's a big old book, and this is a big old book too. But David Copperfield is basically, and I'm not a Dickens scholar. Keep that in mind. It is the fictionalization. It's the closest thing that Dickens in his fiction writing wrote to an autobiography. And it was about his time growing up in poverty, being exploited by orphanage systems, being exploited for labor, all the ways that he was used, and was like really, really pissed off about it. And he put all that stuff out in his book. And a lot of Dickens's work concerns working class people who are impoverished, that struggle in England in the 19th century. And it was something that I was listening to a podcast with Barbara Kingsolver, and she talked about going to visit Dickens' house. I don't know why I'm saying Dickinson. Dickens' house, and seeing where he wrote, and it just kind of, it's this electrifying moment where she's like, Charles Dickens is talking to me, and I need to tell a story like David Copperfield about someone growing up in Appalachia, and she kind of came out of that. I think it's kind of important too when we think about older writers. We think that they're old, they're forgotten. That they were angry about stuff, and they were passionate about stuff, and they were frustrated with systems that they were in, whatever economic spectrum or whatever political or social perspective they were coming from. They were just as angry and frustrated and depressed about things as we are in a sense. And I do want to, there's just to give a little kind of like quote in the book. I'm just going to read a little part because there's a meta part, because I think if you don't have to read David Copperfield to get to appreciate Demon Copperhead, but it is a book, like if you were looking like the plots, you see a lot of the same narrative moves, updatings of characters in the novel. So that's the fun part. But I think, given Dickens' interest in people who are struggling economically, giving them dignity in the story, also it's something that people were reading in the 19th century, is how, in a lot of ways, I'm kind of suddenly fumbling here, but anyway, that kind of struggle, I think, is something that is a vital kind of updating to what we're seeing now in Demon Copperhead and Kingsolver's book. There's even just a slightest little off passage. It's the most meta moment in the book. Demon Copperhead, that's the nickname of the character, whose name his real name is Damon Field, so David Copperfield. So there's some parallels there. And he talks about reading in his English class, and he talks about exactly reading about the book that is he mentions David Copperfield and the updating of it, and he says, likewise, the Charles Dickens one, seriously old guy, dead and a foreigner. But Jesus Christ, did he get the picture on kids and orphans getting screwed over and nobody giving a rat's ass? You'd think he was from around here. And I think that is kind of, it's that narrative structure that Kingsolver uses, and I think it's still one that has relevance today because we still see exploitation and abuse going on. So sadly, the concerns of Charles Dickens in his era are still very much our concerns today. But again, you don't have to read that novel to get that, though. Read widely. Of course, I would just encourage everyone to do that. Yeah.
There's nothing like a retelling to show us really how far we haven't come.
Yeah. Technology may be different, or we may have different names for things, but people are still the same, and they're kind of jerks. So.
Absolutely. And while we were preparing for this, I think you mentioned that this book has been considered poverty porn, but I think we've talked and we both disagree with that assertion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little. That often seems like something you can just. I don't know. What are the expectations, and the expectations in Appalachian literature, or any kind of literature that deals with working class characters or characters that are struggling economically? How are they supposed to depict them as like noble? I think no matter what, it's kind of showing complications that the people who are their reasons why they're doing what they're doing, they may not be the best reasons psychologically, mentally, emotionally, but it's something that gives them credit to being kind of three-dimensional. And I think this is a novel that does. You understand why people do what they do, even if it disappoints you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's got to be a point where we have to be able to talk about what living in poverty is like without automatically saying, oh, well, this is nothing but poverty porn. And I think Barbara Kingsolver does a really good job about being compassionate but realistic about what these impoverished look like. She is acknowledging that there are forces outside of their power that have greatly impacted them, but they're not weaker than those forces a lot of the times. There is a possibility out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it gets into that old nature-nurture thing, and I think it has the book does a nice job of showing a balance of that's circumstances. The Demon Copperhead, for example, he ends up in the foster care system, and he's moving from place to place, and there's a frustration in that, and that this still happens, is not that basically people just see him as a paycheck or labor. In some cases, there's a section where he goes to a farm, and it's a guy who basically he's like the emergency foster care house, And he's like, he puts people to work and he pockets that money and just gives them enough to survive. And it very much like Dickens. Like, I think about like American naturalism of the turn of the century kind of mucker. It's something that just makes you pissed off that this persists.
And at Crikey's farm, I think that going back to your nature versus nurture, we're introduced to a lot of boys like Demon, and we really get to see that nature versus nurture playing out, because gonna do a little spoiler here, when Demon starts playing football, I was wondering, is this going where he's going to end up like Fast Forward? Mm-hmm. Is he going to be the kind of person Fast Forward is? But I think his natural nature would never have let him be as cruel as Fast Forward was, which is something that he comes to learn. That your heroes aren't always your heroes, and you don't want to meet them.
No. I believe in the Dickens version, the equivalent of Fast Forward is this guy named Steerforth, which seems very it's a character he's very Fast Forward / the Steerforth. They're very manipulative. They're very kind of likable and seductive. But they, ultimately there's a scene even where like every night, Fast Forward, there are 3 other boys that are working at Creaky's farm, which is like, it's a very creepy place. And he's like, what do y'all got for me? Basically, that he just is like, he's cool, he's appealing, but he's like really manipulative. And sometimes it just takes you time to realize how skeezy people are,
Yeah, I think that my first hint of who Fast Forward really was the fact that he gave everyone nicknames, and that you weren't cool until he gave you a nickname, which to me, and it seems like is common sometimes when they're trying to dehumanize you or break you away from your identity to make you into what they want. Mm-hmm. And what Fast Forward wanted was a bunch of people who mindlessly just followed him and did what he wanted.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing in the book is followers. Mm-hmm. He gets into football, he has the coach, and he's like, we don't need leaders, we need a lot of good followers who will do just whatever is told of them. And so I think that's a tension in the book, is like, at what point are you independent? At what point are you just following things? Go ahead.
I think in a weird way, this is almost like an Appalachian Cinderella story of this kid who, he was the desolate foster with the evil foster families, and then he got picked up by a good foster family. Mm-hmm. And then that's kind of when his life went in a better direction. But then on to his own decisions and downfallings, he has to continue to overcome, even though his economic situation is much improved.
Yeah. I mean, they're literally chapters of just grim situations for poor Demon Copperhead. And then I often feel like, there's like a chapter or 2 where things are going well. I was like, no, this is going to go bad at some point. And I think it is that there just wouldn't be a story if everything was like it was worse and then it got better and better and better steadily. So it's a real roller coaster.
I felt no relief when things were going okay for Demon, because I knew that if things were going okay, they were getting ready to go very bad.
Yeah. And I think too, it is a book about how adults misuse and abuse children and people, even. Maybe it doesn't necessarily the foster care system, the foster care caseworkers they are exhausted and overwhelmed. Some of them care, but they want to get better jobs. Some of them don't care, and boy, they really don't care. And it's just this kind of circumstance of people being overworked, overwhelmed. There's a lot of stress on all these characters throughout the book.
And I have a couple quotes here or things along those lines that I was going to talk about. Is that even once he was out of foster care, it was still about who is exploiting him. At one point, he talks about how predatory the military is in his school, that those poor kids who have no other choices, the military is there, were still exploiting children. And at one point, the quote, football is a sacrifice for America and him getting hurt during football was a sacrifice for America and Lee County football. And, even then, and it's a problem we still see today with high school, even college athletes, is they are being exploited in a way. Yes, at college they are getting financial incentives, but they don't own their image.
As they should.
Absolutely
NIL
agree.
and things like that is they're working. If they're playing sports, they should be compensated in some way. So, yeah.
So I really liked that this contemporary view of Appalachia is talking about these things because they really are issues. I know we've talked about me. I came from a very small West Virginia town. I was actually familiar with some of the places because I would drive through there every year on my way to Gatlinburg. So I knew the area, and it was very common. Military set up every single day in our high school, and the sports players, their future really didn't matter. But getting a state championship did.
Yeah. I think, too, I mean, the book itself, it's a first-person point of view. So and it is of Demon looking back on his life. And so he has perspective on it. I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
But I think to me, just like being, I was a kid once, and I was a teen boy at one point, and the way he looked at the world, the short-term thinking he had about things, the passion he had about things, his obsession with girls. This all strikes me as very true.
Yes.
To that kind of mindset at that time.
And yeah, I told you that I read this book in part of my book club. One of the things that I was really grateful for was that Kingsolver, I listened to it on audiobook, the narrator throughout the beginning of the book continually reminds you, this is a 10-year-old. This is an 11-year-old. And at my book club, one of the girls was like, he was like 14, 15. And we were like, no, he was 10.
Yeah.
When he ran away. He was 10 when he got robbed by a prostitute. Like, he wasn't, this is a little boy, not a teenager. Teenagers are still little, but.
Yeah. And, he's a character who's had to grow up. His mother was dealing with addiction throughout his life. And the struggles of that made him seem older than he was. And I always think that it's interesting when you've seen a lot of narratives is that they have these relatively a kid that's like 10, 11, or 13, and they seem older, but his life experience really shapes that.
Yeah, for sure. I also thought that it was interesting. There is a little bit. The book is mostly a white cast. There is an interracial couple, which does come into play eventually. But a quote from the book that I thought was interesting, especially in our political times, where a lot of poor white people don't believe in white privilege because they're like, I've struggled too. And so I thought that this quote was really powerful in an explanation of those feelings. Whiteness as their only possession that hasn't been repossessed. So those feelings of, well, yeah, it's the only thing I can have pride in. You've taken everything else from me. I thought was a very interesting perspective and an interesting way to show that difference without getting into the politics of what that actually looks like.
Yeah. And yeah, there is Mr. Anderson.
Armstrong.
Mr. Armstrong. Sorry.
Yeah, you're okay.
That he very much likes to push the students about things
in a good way.
Yeah, and as one having he tries to make them think about things, and it is some of these things, like so many things in living here, growing up. It's like, yeah, I've thought about these things. I think one of the little details, there's a description of the person in a truck driving around, and you may have known this if you live in a small town or a rural area, or maybe even a more urban area. He's driving around with an American flag and a Confederate flag, and
Yes.
and Mr. Armstrong makes this wise point of, like, they fought against each other. Why would you have both flags there? So you have these. In a lot of ways, I think it's maybe one of the more didactic parts of it, but it's kind of massaged because it's him learning about things through dialogue and debate in his class, in his language arts classes. So, but it's something that it's all the. I think in some ways it's all these ideas that and commentary about Appalachia that Kingsolver wants to cram into the book as much as possible. But these are like things I've felt too. So
Absolutely. I mean, I think this book, we have some race components, we have some LGBTQ components, obviously socioeconomic components. This book covers a wide range of political topics without making them political so much in a way, just talking about how they're viewed. But also, it's refreshing because not every character in this book is regressive. There are very progressive characters in this book, and we really get to see how much of an effect they have on the way Demon thinks about life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is someone who is essentially becomes orphaned at one, spoiler, it's early on. He a lot of people come into his sphere of influence and influence him, and in good ways and in bad ways. It's, I think being a child is just being influenced by all these things, and you can go, however much someone cares, you could go a good direction or a bad direction, and so there's just all this, the importance of, that I guess in some ways he's a very like forthright narrator, but he's very passive in that he kind of, whatever situation it is, he becomes that house, he becomes the people he lives with, more or less.
Yeah, and I really think that comes down to him growing up with his mom. And I thought that was one of the most heartbreaking scenes. We've already talked about him becoming an orphan, so clearly his mother dies. When he says, obviously I didn't love her enough for her to beat her addiction. And I think that goes on to later affect him when he becomes what anybody needs him to become. And I think it's all an attempt to make up for the fact that he carried with him that he couldn't save his mother.
Mm-hmm.
It's very...
You get like only children. They don't have a personality. They're stuck in between everybody, which I kind of hate. But I think that I kind of hate that notion as someone who grew up an only child. But it does very much. He wants to be whatever to make people happy. I think that's one of the things that endears him to you. But you're also like, come on, man.
Yeah, I think it definitely becomes a detriment once he meets Dory, because he talks about how giving her fentanyl is loving her. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. Maybe misguided, but it really shows where Demon's head is at that point, where he used to beg his mother to stay off of it. Mm-hmm. And now he's evolved to the point where he's like, no, this is how I love her, is to give her the drug.
Yeah. And I think particularly just stylistically, those chapters are very, you can feel as you read it, like he's just going in, he's rationalizing himself, and his mindset is going into that kind of that perpetual, it seems like maintenance mode of like how do I continue to have enough drugs to do what I need to do to get the person I'm in love with out of pain, and it's like sweet and horrible at the same time.
It is, and I think that it does a great job of showing that once people with substance abuse disorder get so far in their addiction, it's not about recreationally getting high. It's about getting enough that I can get through the day without throwing up. Or he goes to the beach once and he talks about how he knows he's going to dread his stomach hurting. Mm-hmm. And so I think Kingsolver does a beautiful job showing what that transition from recreational to, in a way, medicinal is, especially when it's uncontrolled.
Yeah, it's maintenance.
Yeah.
It's like I want to prevent. And often people will get hooked on it for something like small things like pain issues, and then they are like, now I take it to avoid the pain it causes me, and so it's just a vicious cycle. And to see a bright character have, it's really heartbreaking to see that, and multiple characters that happens to.
The second Demon got hurt playing football, I knew where the story was going. Up until that point, I was just along for the ride. I didn't really know what direction we were going, but the second he got hurt playing football in this era, I knew what was getting ready to happen for him, and it broke my heart.
Yeah, it's tough, and I think in some ways you can, like, dramatically you can see his injury is where he had a certain amount of control or perceived a certain amount, and then now he's out of control at that point. It's kind of like dramatically, like the third act in a tragedy. That's where the character loses his empowerment and has things, he just becomes increasingly disempowered. So
when I was getting ready for this, I was looking at what other people were saying, and someone mentioned that they like the book because Demon has his agency the entire book. And I thought that was an interesting point because to me it felt like, at least in the worst of it, he lost his agency to not only drugs but to Dory as well, because he talks about wanting to leave. I mean, to the point where he's relieved when she's dead.
Yeah.
He's not sad. He says that that's where she belongs. So I thought it was kind of odd to hear somebody say he never lost his agency when I very much felt that his agency was at least hampered by the drugs and Dory.
In a way, it put it like he didn't have a choice. Like he had to. He loved this woman, and he's gonna stick with her. He's gonna try to make her happy. And I think there are there's the Dickensian aspect of a story like this coming out of Dickens is obviously there's lots of characters, so it's a lot. If you've got something that like has a chart that has the characters on it, it can be helpful for this book.
Yes,
because there's a lot of minor characters, a lot of side characters, a lot of characters that come in and out. And often kind of these based on these coincidences. Great Expectations was particularly noted for its coincidences, which makes more sense if you're in a small rural county in Appalachia where everybody knows everybody. And economic struggles, and then I think also the villainy, and there's a certain kind of villainy in a lot, like just kind of wonderful villains. And there's some certainly wonderful villains and certain people that seem to be, they can't help themselves. They're like Dory is someone who cares she took care of her father as he had gotten sick and was dying, but then she can't do basic things like cook or do laundry and it is I think what's interesting is I think at one point in the novel talks about somebody like people when they turn 18, some of them have had kids, some of them have taking care of parents as they were dying. Some of them have jobs, and some of them have never had to do anything in their lives. And it's just such a stark contrast in characters that seem more capable and characters that, what have they been doing all along? Didn't they learn anything?
Yes. Talking about the coincidences, this was something that weeks after I read the book, and I was still thinking about it, that hit me as strange. So we know that Demon's grandmother, who he eventually meets, lives hours away from Lee County. His dad died in Lee County. And yet, his grandmother seems to know a lot of people in Lee County for that to be a coincidence. What are the chances that of all the people, she sends him back to the football coach of Lee County?
Yeah.
I thought that was just very odd.
Yeah. I think that is something that's playing into the updating. Is very like it's something it has a nice, and I think too this is I always think of it that this book is more or less realistic, but it's not like it's reality. I think there's some plot contrivances that tell this kind of coming of age story, as we call in the English department, the Bilbigsroman, kind of the arc of development from from a certain arc of growing up from childhood to maturity, and it just has these things. And as a reader, I think that's the least interesting thing to talk about. What is unrealistic about this novel? Because plenty of novels have their share of little kind of things. You should try not to get so distracted about that.
For me, it was less thinking it was unrealistic and me trying to imagine a storyline where his grandmother is more involved in Lee County than we're getting from Demon's perspective. I liked that idea that she has always been involved in Lee County.
Yeah, there's so many, and the Betsy Woodall, the wonderful and terrifying and cruel sometimes Betsy Woodall. She takes care. She hates men. Men have done bad things to her, and understandably, there's a wonderful great uncle, Mr. Dick, wonderfully detailed and described character. But yeah, she's like, I'm raising young women put them on the good and righteous path, and they're going to be good and righteous people to marry or have jobs and things like that. So she's pretty hardcore.
She always made me laugh because she never said she didn't like men. She didn't like people that stood to pee. And that's how she described it, because she loved Uncle Dick. And he didn't stand to pee because he was disabled. So therefore, which in a weird way I felt like almost took away his masculinity, or like his identity. She was stripping him of being a man by saying, oh, because you can't stand, you're not like other. That's what makes you different.
Yeah. I think so much of, I think you said it in contrast to somebody like Dean, so much of her is defined by how she helps and looks after people, that's her as some sort of hard-ass caregiver or educator, trainer of making children into adults, that's just a way that is, the way she wants to define herself.
The tough Appalachian Meemaw.
Yeah, I do think your Meemaws and Mamaws, they're I think in a lot of ways, Kingsolver plays with those conventions. You have Mrs. Peggott. I would say, Betsy Woodall, that kind of plays with these things, that they are women. They are, I would say, in a lot of ways, they're seen as more complicated as these kind of unsexualized elder women, that they are much more interesting and complicated and mean, but also kind, than we kind of get these kind of stereotypical Mamaw, Meemaw, Granny characters.
Yeah, and I did really like that this book, being contemporary, we talked about this a little bit, breaks a lot of Appalachian tropes while staying in line with them. For instance, a lot of the books from Appalachia have religion at the heart of them in some way. And in this book, Demon makes sure to tell you multiple times that he thinks religion is nothing but superhero stories. So I really thought that was a refreshing take, because it shows that there is even religious diversity or thought diversity in these areas that are heavily Bible Belt.
Yeah. I can't remember. Sometimes I think there's one point at it where, the characters don't even know that much about the Bible, actually. So it's not like the characters are they're very religious and they're well read in the Bible. It feels like a perfunctory thing. There's a fair amount of funerals described in this film. In this book. I don't know why I'm saying film. I don't think this would make a good film. It would, and something maybe it makes sense to be more, given its length, to be something that would be longer, something that needs to take its time to tell its story. But yeah, there are multiple funeral scenes and different kind of very different vibes that those give off. And they're not necessarily warm and comfy ones for the most part.
Not to backtrack, but bringing up the funerals brings me back to that idea of agency, where it shows, once again, that Demon had none. He had no control over his mom's funeral. He had no control over Dory's funeral. But he didn't feel like fighting for control of those things. When he lost the house that Dory lived in, he didn't fight him over it. He was just like, well, that's the way life goes. And I think that is a very Appalachian trait. I'm in the dark year right now. It's going to get better, but
yeah, it plays into that kind of idea of fatalism, or kind of, we'd see that, I think, definitely with Appalachian literature, kind of literary naturalism, that things are defined by biological, social, economic things. The characters in kind of naturalistic novels, to think about Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane, is a good example that they're not really that much in control of what we think about agency in works that came before or after. I was kind of thinking about the boy story aspect, and I think it's interesting. You have a woman writing about that experience, and I think there's been these kind of I think there tends to be a distinction between kind of, that I've noticed, and this is not, I'm not making overly broad, but there's kind of women writers from Appalachian, male writers from Appalachia have a kind of, you can see certain differences in them and what they focus on. Or I think in a lot of ways, women authors have a tendency to think about community, multiple narrators, and then, or even if they're writing from a first-person perspective. I think somebody like Nima Avashia and her novel, her memoir about growing up Indian American in Appalachia, is a sense of like talking about the community and explaining the community and all of those things, and little essays about neighbors and things like that. Really sweet stuff and really good stuff. And the ways in which another Appalachia's her book, and some of the male narratives tend to be a little narrator dominated in some way. It was this quote. I don't know if any of our viewers might be familiar with the Appalachian writer Scott McClanahan. He's out of West Virginia. He wrote the novel. He wrote. I don't mean to sound like my students, like everything's a novel. No, but he wrote his memoir Crappalachia, and I remember liking it. And then I read the appendix where he says all the things that weren't actually what actually happened, which I guess I appreciate that, but then I feel annoyed that I was snookered. But there's one little thing that really has always gotten to me in that. See, I have bad eyesight, so I need to find it here. So it's this little passage. Got here. Oh, here we go. This is a line. This is from his appendix, and it's just a chapter by itself. This book should not be thought of or included in a genre of literature called the Appalachian Minstrel Show. The names of writers who have written in this genre include Lee Smith, Mary Lee Settle, Silas House, and a list that goes on and on. They know who they are. And so he's highlighting women authors and a gay Appalachian author. And I think you could include somebody like Barbara Kingsolver in that bunch. And to me, in a lot of ways, it feels like this is a book that's kind of taking, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, it's theory, that it's someone that's like, oh, you're going to do that and talk crap about us. And I'm going to show you what I can do in your type of story.
Yeah, for sure. I think also that Barbara Kingsolver isn't worried about masculinity.
Yeah.
So she can tell the story in the vulnerability way of the way that maybe these male authors don't feel comfortable talking about that vulnerability. She can talk about that because it's not her vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, not that she wouldn't talk about her own vulnerability.
Yeah.
But she's far enough removed.
Yeah.
But still in these communities to know what it looks like.
Yeah, and I think too, this is an advantage of getting older. You have a little perspective about things, and maybe things soften, and you're willing to kind of show those vulnerabilities. But I do think it's a very thoughtful work about the perspective of a young boy turning into a teen and growing up. I just think that's one of the strengths of the book. So
I wish this book would have been out for our first podcast, so we could have talked about it, Hillbilly Elegy, and October Sky all at one time, because I see a lot of overlap with both of those stories because they are a young male coming of age in a poor area. So I wish that maybe we could have talked about, or that it would have been out for us to have really examined those connections.
Yeah, I think there are, you could certainly see parallels, and obviously her work is a work of fiction and not based on any particular life, and then using the Charles Dickens David Copperfield as something to pattern that after. But yeah, the son dealing with a mother who's struggling with addiction, and you see a lot of these parallels in this,
or even just emotionally lonely, like Homer Hickham's mom was regularly characterized as.
And I think maybe, and again, not to say one genre, one medium, one genre does better than the other, but I think this is one that it gives itself time to kind of explain the motivations. And I think as a character, he's got a little distance to things. He's still angry about a lot of things.
For sure.
But he also kind of sees things. If it was something where it was a story where it's just like something bad happens and his immediate response to it, I think it would be a very different book. But we see him kind of looking back on things. So I think he's got a measure of reflection and meditation on the past.
And yet I really felt like, even though the whole book is narrated by a grown man, that the way it's written does change as he gets older. So it's like we're still getting the story from a 10-year-old little boy.
Yeah.
But an old man telling And I thought my favorite part of this whole book was just Demon's voice.
Mm-hmm.
The way she wrote it, she didn't back away from any bad language, any slang. I loved Demon's voice in it.
Yeah, it feels authentic.
Yes.
It feels like somebody's just talking to you. And I think that's a special skill to have it where you're reading something and it feels like someone is talking to you, just in conversation, shooting the breeze. And I think that's not an easy thing to do, and it's a very kind of effective thing to do.
I agree. And I think that I mentioned to you earlier that I actually listened to the audiobook, to which I highly recommend. A lot of audiobooks around this area I get kind of irritated with because I feel like the narrators either put on or over-exaggerate. This author, there were times I thought he sounded like my husband. Mm-hmm. So I just the accent did an amazing job, I think, the narration.
And I think too, I mean, the language itself it doesn't fall into this kind of, when you read it, it's very easy to understand. It's not like it's in dialect or vernacular, which is very on the outs anyway, but it feels very, it's something, it's very kind of rich, deep language that it's a long book. It takes your time to read it, but it feels very smooth. This is someone who spent a lot of time making sure that everything sounded good and the details and the language had impact as it went along. This was not shoddily put together. No,
not at all. In fact, I think my one critique of the book is that, surprisingly, I wish it were either longer or a series. I think Dr. Lumpkin knows, but I am very interested in AIDS education and preventing the spread. And we know now, especially in our area, we're seeing it more through needles than sexual contact. And that's one thing that Demon says. I don't like needles, so I don't use them. But that there is no mention at all of even like hepatitis or other diseases because Dory was shooting up. And I thought that was a miss, but also that it ends so quickly that 3 of the characters, I'm not going to mention their names, go off to rehab and then they're good. They don't beat it. So I actually looked up the statistic. I know you said you hate when they're not realistic, but this just why I wish it were a little longer. That 72 to 88% of people that have gone to an inpatient treatment at their year follow-up have relapsed, and that comes from the Journal of Addiction. In an article called Predictors of Relapse After Inpatient Opioid Detoxification During 1-Year Follow-Up. So if Dickens's book is 1,000 pages, I wish we saw a little bit more of that struggle with getting clean.
You want more.
That it wasn't as easy and cut as, oh, I went away and now I'm okay. That's just not.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I think that it is this desire to have some sort of resolution, have some sort of happy ending in a happy ending.
Yeah.
Bittersweet, marginally happy ending, particularly for an Appalachian book. And that it is one of these, I think it's almost like that there's a clarity of that in the sense that this is the thing he needs to focus on and get clear of in his life, because this is the thing that brings him down.
Yeah.
It's the thing that brought his mother down. And there's a clarity with it. I don't think this is like a model example of how to do this. And people who are struggling with opiate, it's going to be a long road back with relapses.
For
it's
sure.
not going to be easy. It's a lifelong thing to kind of work through and negotiate. And
there's people that go 10, 20 years without it and then relapse.
Yeah.
I think that is my only critique. And if anything, it says great things about the book that I just wanted more.
Yeah.
I didn't want a tight, clean wrap up. I wanted to be hurt more.
Yeah, you wanted more suffering.
I just didn't feel fully satisfied at the end, I think.
Yeah.
It felt too easy.
Yeah. I wonder if it's, even if a book like this, I mean, you do have certain books that can go, 1,000-page fantasy novels and things like that go on for quite some time in elaborate detail. But I think it was a need to wrap it up. I'm not agreeing with the reality of it, but it is. I think it's a character who suffered a lot, and it's some hope at the end. It's some hope of control, at the end of a novel, and some twinkling of hope. Yeah,
For sure.
but yeah.
All right. I think we're getting ready to wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah,
or
I think
anything you'd like to share?
it's an excellent book to read. Take your time with it. There's a lot to. I had a lot of. I'm one of these people that have to buy their own books, so I have to mark it up. And there's a lot of plus signs and frowny signs, and there's a lot of just lovely language. We'll save that for you. And even if you know the plot details, I think it's very compelling just to read this book from beginning to end. So.
One of my book club members actually said they started reading it again right after they finished reading it, and that it's even better on the second read because you know where it's going to see things that you didn't get the first time you went through it.
So it's as I think Jesse Pinkman on Breaking Bad once said, this thing is layered like nachos. So
For sure.
It certainly is a rich book, and I'm really glad to see it's getting the recognition as it is. It certainly seems to be. Kingsolver, who's had a wonderful writer, just a really go out and buy it, go out and check it out at your library. It's worth a read. So
speaking of buying it, we picked this book not just because it's Appalachian popular and a Pulitzer Prize winner. One of our local bookshops, Book Tenders, actually won a competition. They sold more copies of Demon Copperhead than any other store in the country. So Barbara Kingsolver is actually doing a reading and possibly a signing.
Yeah, I believe so.
Of her book. We don't have a date for that. They are shooting for summer. But we will keep you updated when we get that information. But remember to go support Book Tenders. It's a great place to get wine and books all at once. And you can find them at 621 Central Avenue, right there in Barbersville.
And if you're not around our area of West Virginia, make sure to support your local bookstores and support your local libraries. They're wonderful people that work at those places. Give them some of your business. They'll be happy to help you find what you might be wanting. So,
Absolutely agree. Thank you.
have a good day.